what remains with me is that he was just such a decent, honorable person, quiet, self-effacing, but he was always, and right up until literally last year, when I last spoke with him, his thoughts were always about how we make life better for people, how we sort of smooth out the bumps in life, and that's what I remember about him. He was just always concerned about injustice and unfairness, and he had this abiding faith that government could be a force for good. He said that so many times, that if you just have good people who are public spirited minded, government can make life better for people. That's the Neil Smith I remember.
Neil Smith was the epitome of an honest, effective, hardworking, and selfless public servant, and his commitment to our shared home here at Drake University can be seen across campus. His and Bee's relationship with Senator Harkin and Ruth dates back to the 1950s, when Senator Harkin knocked on doors for Congressman Smith when he first won election to the House of Representatives. As many of you know, Senator Harkin served as a novice staffer for Congressman Smith in the summer of 1969, and that experience inspired Tom to pursue his own career in public service. We worked to build on the legacy by offering a Washington, D.C. Experience Scholarship to help expose students to policymakers and the policymaking process, and most importantly, to ensure that those internship opportunities are available to everyone, including students with financial need. Since the Institute's establishment at Drake, we've always been able to count on Congressman Smith to join us for this event and many others. From our Sussman Lecture Series to our Harkin on Wellness Symposium, we're grateful to his daughter Sharon and his son-in-law Kevin for being with us here tonight. Thank you for joining us. I also want to take a moment to recognize Senator Bob Dole, who passed away on Sunday. It's fitting that on this, the 80th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor, we celebrate both Congressman Smith, who enrolled in the military after the attack, and Senator Dole, who survived life-threatening injuries in World War II and went on to make a profound impact as a public servant and lifelong advocate for Americans with disabilities. He and Senator Harkin were also dear friends. In fact, it was Bob Dole who ensured that an interpreter could be present when Tom Harkin was sworn into the Senate so that Tom's brother Frank could take part in the occasion. As Senator Harkin said recently, Neil Smith and Bob Dole are both significant members of the greatest generation, and we have much to learn from their work and the way they conducted themselves. We will all miss their warmth, wisdom, and kindness. In some ways, it's hard to reconcile these two public servants with the Congress we see today. But tonight, as we do every year, we'll ask Charlie Cook to do his best to break it all down for us. We're especially excited to welcome Charlie back to Des Moines in person. And on a positive note, I checked the forecast. It looks clear, so we're hoping for no blackouts tonight, Charlie, right? We do have a small in-person audience here this evening, so Charlie doesn't have to talk to an empty room. But aside from the speakers here at the podium, we're fully masked and continue to practice safety measures related to COVID-19. As a reminder, we will have a moderated Q&A with Charlie after his remarks, and you can share questions through the Q&A box or the chat feature on Zoom. You also can text them to the number on the screen. For those of you here in person, you can share your questions by using the index cards you received at registration. Tonight's program is made possible by a donor who wishes to remain anonymous. We're tremendously grateful for their support, which always allows us to host this highly anticipated event every year. Since our event with Charlie last year, much has happened in the world of politics, from an ongoing pandemic to partisan local elections. We've just about seen it all. Through everything, the Harkin Institute has continued to conduct research, publish policy reports, and host events to engage Iowans and Americans. We couldn't do that without the leadership and vision of our National Advisory Council, Drake University, and our generous donors. I'd like to recognize some of those individuals who've joined us here tonight. We're pleased to have members of our National Advisory Council here this evening to include Ruth Harkin, Marcia Turnus, Michael Gardner, Steve Sukup, and of course, Charlie Cook. I'd also like to thank our Provost, Sue Madison, and Vice President of University Advancement, John Smith, for joining us here tonight and for their continuous commitment and support of the Harkin Institute. We've also been hard at work through the adversity of the past 2 years. In August, we hosted an Iowa Summit on Disability Employment, where using our network of expertise from our global summit, we brought together leaders in the Iowa business community to help them take steps towards creating workplaces inclusive of people with disabilities. In October, we had our fall Sussman lecture with author and professor Annette Gordon-Reed, where she discussed her new book on Juneteenth that outlined the long road to making Juneteenth a national holiday. This semester, we also welcomed new staff members, including our Director of Retirement Security, Raina Stoicheva, and our Director of Disability Policy, Daniel Van Zant, who have hit the ground running and are already making great contributions to the Institute. Now, as a lot of things these days, it feels as though there's always something new happening in Washington, and at the same time, things seem to drag on in Washington. Will Congress pass the Human Infrastructure Bill? Are we facing another shutdown? How will redistricting impact Congress and our state legislatures over the next decade? Here to break it all down for us is Charlie Cook, one of the most revered political analysts in the country. Charlie is the founder of and contributor to the Cook Political Report. He also serves on the Harkin Institute's National Advisory Council and is a contributor for the National Journal and NBC News. Please help me welcome Charlie Cook.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's 5 weeks ago when we heard that Congressman Smith had passed away, one of my second or third thoughts was, how can we do this lecture without Neil Smith here? I've never done it without him in the audience, and I've always thought, what in the hell did he think he could learn from me? I mean, really, but I could say that about dozens of other people that were always coming. But he was such a remarkable person and setting, and I had not realized. I guess I knew that he had served in Congress longer than any other member from Iowa, and that Michael Gartner's had a wonderful line, and that was that. Make sure I get this right. Everything good about Iowa comes from either God or Neil Smith, and I think that's pretty awesome. But I might throw in Tom and Ruth Harkin just for a good measure. But people have just done so much for this wonderful state, and Joseph already mentioned this, but. Kind of the juxtaposition with Senator Dole passing away on Sunday, and I know Senator Harkin saw him in October. Went over to the Dole's apartment and had a chance to visit with him, and just we don't make people like that anymore. And when I get worried about our country and the future and what's happening, and I think, boy, I sure hope the millennials and Generation X and Z, I hope they do a little better job than us baby boomers did with this, and hopefully they will. But any of you that haven't read the wonderful book by Richard Ben Kramer, What It Takes, and I think it's the most remarkable book about American politics I've ever read, and where it looked at a group of a half dozen people that ran for president back in 1988, and what made them different, what built their character and separated them from all the other, millions of other people that have political aspirations but don't make it to that level. But really an incredible book. But let's get started. Every election I can remember, I've heard somebody say, "Oh, this is going to be the most important election in American history, or since democracy is founded by the Athenians or something." But I'm not going to necessarily claim that, but I think this election coming up next year, a little less than a year from now, I think it really does have an incredibly outsized importance for our country. And I know you can say that about a lot of elections, but think of it this way. We're coming in, 3 points, and I'll go into each one for elaborate a little more. Number one, and this is kind of obvious, that the country is so evenly and narrowly divided. Second, that our politics was really pretty stable, relatively stable, until about 30 years ago, when suddenly it became incredibly volatile, just explosive. And the third thing is the consequences of party change, going from all Republican to all Democrat or all Democrat, so much greater than it ever was back in the old days, because the parties have moved so far apart. So let's talk about that for a second. A lot of my Democratic friends like to point to the fact that President Biden won the popular vote by 5 percentage points, just under 5 percentage points, and which is double Hillary Clinton's 2 points, about 7 million votes, which is more than double Clinton's 3 million. But when you look at the way, it's like going to a football game and watching total yardage gained as opposed to the points on the scoreboard. That's not how we decide who wins the elections. And when you look at how it really matters, wow, this country is even closer than I think a lot of people appreciate. And when you think of in 2016, we had 6 states that were decided by 1.5 points or less, 6 states. And Donald Trump won 4 out of the 6. And then you had this last election, you had 5 that were determined by 1.5 points or less. And Joe Biden won 4 out of 5. So in each case, just these elections, just tiny little numbers of votes, percentage points of votes, made all the difference in the world. And that the presidency basically came down to fewer than 126,000 votes in Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Wow. And then you look at the U.S. Senate. And if you think about it, remember right after coming out of the election, Democrats had 48 seats. And then on January 5th, they won both the Georgia seats, but where the 49th seat was Raphael Warnock over Kelly Loeffler by a little bit under 94,000 votes, that's all. And then the 50th was John Ossoff over David Perdue by less than 55,000 votes. So when you think of a country with, 330 million people, and Chuck Schumer is the majority leader instead of Mitch McConnell by fewer than 55,000 votes, or you look over at the House of Representatives where, and I should put in the context of the Senate, this was only the second time since we started the direct election of senators in 1914 that a new Congress began with the Senate absolutely evenly divided. Then you look over at the House. Only 2 times before in the last 100 years has the House been this close. And when you think about it, that basically it came down to fewer than 32,000 votes total scattered across 5 congressional districts made Nancy Pelosi Speaker instead of Kevin McCarthy. Wow. Big consequences, very small numbers of votes. And then you think of the narrowly together, that's evenly, but then narrowly, in the sense that, people think, the polls show that 40% of Americans call themselves independents and 30% Republicans and 30% Democrats. But as you know, of the 40% who call themselves independents, 3/4 of them aren't. They either lean Republican and vote Republican 80% of the time, or they lean Democrat and vote Democratic 80% of the time. So it's only about 10 percentage points of the entire electorate is really independent. And if you think of it, if both sides are each side's at 45 each, wow, that just doesn't take much to happen to tip an election nationally, whether you talk about the presidency or the House or the Senate, to tip it one way or the other. Now, the stability, things were stable, really fairly stable until kind of 1992, 3, 4, right around in there. And if you think about it, going into 1992, when George H.W. Bush was running for re-election, going into 1992, Republicans had won the presidency in 4 out of 5 elections. 4 out of 5. Nixon twice, Reagan twice, and Carter won, but that was the election right after, it probably had a little bit to do with President Ford's part of President Nixon and Watergate and all of that. But at the same time, going into the 94 midterm election 2 years later, Democrats had won majorities in the House for 20 consecutive elections, so 40 years of Democratic majorities, and Democrats had won the majorities in the Senate in 17 out of 20, so 34 out of 40 years. So it was as if Republicans all but owned the White House and Democrats all but owned the Congress, and it was as if voters found their own way of their own form of checks and balances or separation of powers. And it sort of created a certain stability that quite frankly, it served us reasonably well. Then things changed. And if you think back, we now have, for the first time in American history, 4 consecutive presidents have lost control of both the House and the Senate while they were in office. 4 times in a row. Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and now Donald Trump. An explosiveness that we just sort of never had back in the old days. And that if you think about the last 8 elections, so it's 4 presidentials, 4 midterms, that the presidency, the House, or the Senate have flipped in 7 out of 8. The only time it didn't was 2012, President Obama's re-election year, that nothing switched sides in that election. And obviously, and I won't dwell on this, that straight party voting has a lot to do with it. When you've got Democrats voting for Joe Biden by an 89-point margin and Republicans voting for Donald Trump by an 88-point margin, when you have 91% of all the people that voted for Hillary Clinton voted for Joe Biden, and 85% of the people that voted for Donald Trump the previous time voted for Donald Trump this time, that we're now to the point where so many voters, no matter how bad a candidate from their party is, they're going to vote for him. No matter how good a candidate for the other party is, and whether it's House, Senate, up down the line. I mean, the numbers that in 2016 was the first election since we started electing senators, that every single U.S. Senate race went exactly the same way it had gone in the presidential. And last year, it was 34 out of 35, with Susan Collins the only one that didn't. And that it used to be that between a fifth and a half of the U.S. Senate, or of the states, had one senator from each party. Now it's down to 6. You look at the House of Representatives, it used to be between 100 and 200 districts would have voted for one party for president and the other party for the House of Representatives. And now it's down to 16 out of the entire 435. And so this evenly balanced means that it doesn't take much for it to flip over, but the straight voting with one block going to vote Democrat no matter what, another block going to vote Republican no matter what it's done is it's created high floors and low ceilings for parties. And whether you're talking about the House, the Senate, or the presidency, high floors and low ceilings. Well, think of the consequence of that, and I'll get more into this in a minute, but we used to have landslide elections from time to time. You know, you think back to Franklin Roosevelt over Herbert Hoover in 1932, where Roosevelt won by an 18-point margin and winning 42 states. Or 1964, Lyndon Johnson beating Barry Goldwater by 23 points, winning 44 states. Or Nixon over McGovern by 23 points, 49 states. Ronald Reagan over Jimmy Carter by 10 points, 45 states. Ronald Reagan over Walter Mondale by 18 points, 49 states. You used to have these kind of big, somebody could really run up the score. Then you had the two Clinton elections, sort of transitional, where Clinton beat George H.W. Bush by 6 points, won 32 states, and then in 96 beat Senator Dole by 13 points, 31 states. But now think of the last 6 presidential elections. 2 of them were inverted, you know, where the popular vote went one way and the electoral vote went the other. And of the other 4, one, George W. Bush over John Kerry, was by a 3-point margin. Another, Obama over Romney, was by a 4-point margin. Biden over Trump by 5 points. And one by 7 points. President Obama over John McCain. And so that now we're kind of these high floors, low ceilings, that races are going to be closer. And I'm going to talk about this in a minute. But what that means is, because you basically can't have landslides now, can you have a mandate? Can any president have a mandate to do things? But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here. Then the final point was the stakes are so much higher. And when you think about back in the day when, you know, the Democratic Party was a center-left party, Republican Party was a center-right party, you had a lot of ancestral partisans, people that were Democrats or Republicans because their parents or their grandparents or their great-grandparents were Democrats or, you know, Republicans, or maybe it was religion, or maybe it was what part of the country, or maybe it was income or education. But there were a lot of things that went in the mix other than just ideology. And then we started seeing that ideological sorting taking place, so that if you were a liberal and a Republican, or you were an independent and a Republican, a liberal independent, you started migrating over to the Democratic Party. And if you were a conservative Democrat or a conservative independent, started migrating over to the Republican Party. So this sorting out started taking place to the point where, you know, the parties both became very, very, very ideologically cohesive, and that we started seeing. Then you had a handful of personalities, and think of on the Republican side, think of Newt Gingrich. And then more rhetorically speaking, Pat Buchanan and Sarah Palin. Think about sort of the edginess that they introduced into the process, and that sort of sharpened the lines. And you could just as easily, you could say more recently, and maybe to a little bit lesser extent, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, just sort of sharpening the edges that were there. Then throw in the changing media climate where, you know, away from the time, you know, the 3 news magazines and 3 networks and your, you know, local newspaper, to now where what does media mean? It means talk radio, it means cable television, it means social media, it means either very conservative, very liberal websites. Then you throw in gerrymandering. And so that we've created these ideological silos on each side, these echo chambers. And then it's all made worse by, and a lot of these people are on either cable television or on talk radio, but basically political arsonists. That what they do is set fires and fan flames that just exacerbates things even more. So that now the difference, even though there's not that wide of a gap between the parties in terms of size, The difference between Republicans having the presidency of the House and the Senate and Democrats have, from a policy standpoint, it's like night and day. So that small changes in votes, huge policy consequences. And then one other thing, a point on this, and then we'll get more into the election, and that is that each of the parties, we're losing our ideological diversity within each party, because not only are the parties moving farther apart, but the center of gravity in each party is moving outward, and the tolerance of divergent points of view. And whether you're thinking about, a couple months ago, I was sat in a office of a Republican House member who voted for impeachment and later voted for the infrastructure package. And he played for me a death threat that he had received, a voicemail. And then his chief of staff played another one for me. And this friend, actually, Fred Upton, was on CNN on Anderson Cooper's show, and they played a death threat that I had never heard anything like this, like this kind of thing going on. But think about the pressure that those people are under, and then look over on the Democratic side, where Manchin and Sinema are getting practically drummed out of the party in some party organizations back in their, at least back in Arizona anyway. But there's just less tolerance for divergent points of view. But the bottom line on this is nowadays, and it goes back to this whole mandate thing, no win is too small to declare a mandate now. If you think about it, it's sort of like mandate is a state of mind, not really the magnitude of a victory. But I'll get to that more in a second. Okay, in this election, first, the House is obviously much more likely much more likely to flip than the Senate. As you know, it's only Democrats have a 5-seat margin, and when you take between reapportionment and redistricting, and with reapportionment meaning splitting up the number of seats that each state gets, it looks like Republicans will probably pick up net about 3 seats off of that. In other words, there were 6 states that gained seats in the House of Representatives, and 5 states gained 1 seat each, and Texas picked up 2, and Donald Trump won 4 out of those 6. And of the 7 states that lost a seat, at least one, or that lost 1 seat, 5 of those voted for Joe Biden. So just on that, before you get to redistricting, might be maybe 3 seats, something like that. Then you get to redistricting. And while the Republican advantage isn't quite as great as it was 10 years ago, it's still really substantial, with Republicans basically having a free hand at drawing the lines in states with 187 congressional districts. And keep in mind, a majority is 218. Democrats only have a majority in states with 75 districts. Then you've got the 121 districts that are in states that are the lines were theoretically being drawn by independent commissions. Sadly, not like Iowa's, but some of these independent commissions aren't terribly independent, or where the legislatures are basically grabbing it out of the hands of the commission and drawing the lines anyway, so that in much more of those states, it's drifting over Republicans, so that it's probably, between reapportionment and redistricting, that's probably the equivalent of about 10 districts. Notwithstanding, and then you're saying, okay, well, what's going to happen in terms of the political environment, or who wins primaries, and all of that, and so that you look at that and you say, it'd be too strong to say it'd take a miracle for Democrats to hold on to the House, but it would be pretty different. And I'll talk about the dynamics in midterms in just a second, but in the Senate, everyone knows it's 50-50, and that with Republicans having 20 seats up and Democrats only 14 seats up, that looks one way. And with Republicans had 5 open seats and Democrats had none until Pat Leahy announced his retirement a month or so ago. So that would seem to have more Republican exposure in the Senate. But when you really boil it down, there are only about 8 states that are competitive states that have Senate races, and that basically Democrats have 3 seats to worry about in Arizona with Mark Mark Kelly, in Georgia, Raphael Warnock, in Nevada with Catherine Cortez Masto. And then Republicans basically have three for sure that they have to worry about. Open seats in Pennsylvania, where Pat Toomey is retiring, North Carolina, where Richard Burr is, and Wisconsin's going to be really close, whether Ron Johnson runs again or not. And then there's some more open seats that if Republicans nominate the wrong people, that they could have problems with, maybe in, say, Ohio or Missouri, for example. So that the Senate really is kind of a more of a fair fight, if you will, in terms of what's up and what's likely to be competitive. Now, we all know the history of midterm elections, that since the Civil War, the party in the White House has lost seats in 36 out of 39 midterm elections, 92%, and where the exceptions were pretty exceptional circumstances. Now, if you just look at the average since 1934, the average is a 28-seat loss. However, I'm not really comfortable with doing it quite that way, and the way I look at it is I look at post-World War II, I look at only first-term midterm elections and only those of elected presidents. So, in other words, leaving out like Ford or the Johnson's first midterm election or something like that, and in which case the average is basically 20 seats in average seat lost for the party in the White House. But keep in mind that Democrats lost 13 seats, and usually you don't lose seats when you're winning a presidential race, but because Democrats lost 13 seats in the last election, and there's so many fewer competitive districts now, whatever number Democrats might lose is probably going to be 13 less or so than what it otherwise would be, because one of the ironclad laws of one of the ironclad laws of life is, death, taxes, that an A seat on an airliner is always going to be a window, and you can't lose a seat that you don't have anymore. And so that kind of reduces the profile some. But now in the Senate, though, the pattern isn't nearly as strong. It's only 19 out of 26 since we started electing senators, and the average in a first-term midterm election is only 1, but the average in a second-term midterm election is 7. So the overall average of 3 is kind of misleading. You probably ought to look at just the first. But some of these we've had in recent years, as you know, have just been huge. Now, what is it? I mean, do voters have their clocks, their calendars marked? No. But I think that the shorthand we say, well, midterm elections are a referenda on the incumbent president. And okay, that's true as far as it goes, but I think probably a better way of looking at it is look at each of the three groups. If you're the members of a president's own party, they may be satisfied. They may be, the voters in that party, they may be satisfied at the come midterm election. They may be complacent. They may be disappointed, but they're rarely ecstatic, because they got what they wanted. Conversely, and as a result, their turnout doesn't tend to be quite as big. But you look over on the opposition party, they're madder than hell. They want revenge. They didn't like the last outcome, and they wanted, and their turnout typically is higher. And so just a motivational thing, and it's only when you get to that narrow slice of real independence that it's actually more of a referendum on the incumbent president. And that independents, they typically break against a president's party, no matter what, and they oftentimes get buyer's remorse. Maybe they had unrealistic expectations, whatever reason, but they typically kind of turn the other way. But that's really, in terms of the referendum, it's really only really them that really matters. So, coming in, where are we? This afternoon, the Wall Street Journal just released their latest poll, and they used to pair up with NBC, where it was the Peter Hart Research was the biggest of the Democratic polling firms, and Public Opinion Strategies was the biggest Republican firm, and they did NBC and the Wall Street Journal together. Wall Street Journal is just split off, and what they've done is they've got two firms doing it, but John Anzalone's firm, who is President Biden's pollster, and Tony Fabrizio, who was Donald Trump's pollster, working together, and they released their first survey today. But you look, and that drives home the point about how narrowly divided we are. President Biden's favorable rating, 43. Donald Trump's, 41. Both of them had unfavorables of 54. Wow, that's not much of a difference. You had job approval rating. Biden was at 41 disapprove, 41 approve, 57 disapprove. Trump was 48 approve, 50 disapprove. Maybe absence makes the heart grow fonder. But in a ballot test between the two, Biden's ahead by 1 point, 46 to 45. And when you look at the favorable, unfavorables for the two parties, both of them had favorables of 43%. You look at the Real Clear Politics average of all the major national polls, President Biden has a 43% approval, same thing as in 538, and in the last Gallup it was 42%. But what was really interesting, and this is comparing, that puts President Biden, his numbers are better than President Trump's were at this point, but below those of every other elected president in the post-war period. I think his numbers, his slide, presidents don't get honeymoons anymore. I mean, they barely get long weekends. And President Biden's numbers had kind of gradually come down, and then midsummer, and a little bit of Afghanistan, a little bit of economy, started coming down a little faster. But what's interesting is if you look at among Democrats to this, the last Gallup, he had a 90% approval rating among Democrats. That's terrific. And among Republicans, he had a 6% job approval rating. Well, the thing is, at this point in American politics, we've grown so tribal that President Biden is not going to drop much, if any, below 90. You can't drop any more than the Republican 6. I mean, really. But his approval rating with independents was at 37%. But when you consider that 37%, it's probably mostly the independents who lean Democrat, and we know 80% of them typically vote Democrat. So that, in other words, President Biden, his numbers can't drop much, if any, below where they are. And again, we're at the high floors and low ceilings, but it looks like he's kind of bottomed out. So where are we now? And I mentioned a little while ago that you can't have landslides anymore because of the high floors and low ceilings. So that those kind of big wins that you had before, sort of couldn't happen. But that creates a governing situation, because that if you try to do big things, you try to do, President Biden's the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the BBB, the sort of more social, softer infrastructure bills between the two. I mean, it was David Brooks in the New York Times that referred to them as transformational. And in another times in the headline, it was, cradle to grave, social spending, more of a European style, somebody else said. But the thing about it is, and when I look at the packages, and gosh knows the infrastructure, we hadn't spent enough in 30 years. We probably could have spent double that and still not caught up with where we should be. And on the softer side, you look at these programs, and a lot of them, they really are good ideas and would benefit millions and millions and millions of people. But the totality of it is really big, and that's where Brooks and others get into the transformational thing, and where you get into the comparisons of what Franklin Roosevelt tried to do with the New Deal and what Lyndon Johnson tried to do with the Great Society. But there's one big difference, that Franklin Roosevelt was dealing, when he came into office, he had 59 Democratic senators, 9 more than President Biden's 50. And President Roosevelt had 313 Democrats in the House. President Biden only has 222. Then you look at the Lyndon Johnson comparison. President Johnson had 68 Democrats in the Senate in 65. 68. He had 295 Democrats in the House of Representatives. So of course they were able to do transformational things. That's what I think is so miraculous about what Speaker Pelosi has been able to do, to get through what she's gotten through with microscopic margins. But the thing is, this is really, really hard, and it was definitely really, really daring. And it's hard not only because you don't have sort of the moral political authority that you get from a landslide win, and not only because you don't have any votes to spare, or in the Senate, you have 50, but also because you don't have the fear on Capitol Hill, or you're less like fear or maybe respect that if somebody won a landslide and led a massive victory in the House and Senate, that people are going to give you a little distance there. And so what President Biden and Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader Schumer are doing, it's sort of trying to do a huge amount, not working with much at great risk. And does this work? Does this not work? We'll see, but it was definitely kind of a risky thing to do. And, I don't know. I would have, I guess I come back to, where was it? President Jefferson said back in 1808, he was considering changing the conscription, the draft laws, a major change. And he wrote to a friend that great innovation should not be forced on slender majorities. And this is a big set of pieces of legislation with really slender majorities, obviously, as I said, at great risk. So what's going to happen? As I said, the House looks really tough. And I think the one thing that may happen is we are seeing former President Trump, trying to settle scores and wade in. Well, for example, he's wading in Republican primaries against 3 sitting Republican governors. He's doing, sort of lots of, to the extent that he is going in to settle scores or to back backers of his, regardless of whether they're the strongest candidates or not. And then just this sort of the modern day of the Tea Party movement with what you did see back in 2010, 2012. Between the two, given the close margins, it doesn't take that many places that if Republicans nominate the wrong people, they can cost themselves the majority. And you might go, in 2010, Republicans didn't get that majority in the Senate pretty much because of those 2 seats that they punted away. So does that happen? Can that happen? And I know I'm gone. We need to get to questions. Let me just make two last points. We don't know what the impact. First of all, what's the Supreme Court going to do on the Mississippi case? If they affirm the Mississippi law, which is in effect, I'm not a lawyer, a lot of you are, effectively repealing Roe v. Wade, would that make a huge difference or not? Or would just trimming it back? Now, Republicans, there's some nervousness there. And I was talking to a Republican pollster, trading emails with a Republican pollster on Friday who was quite concerned because this pollster said, the group that Republicans had lost since 2016 were suburban women, had moved away from the Republican Party. Does that cause a pause or maybe a retreat? But because remember in Virginia, in November, Virginia and New Jersey, some of those came back a little towards Republicans. Does it nip that in the bud? But on the other hand, the pro-life folks have typically shown more, they're less numerous, but have typically shown more energy. Does the pro-choice crowd, do they, because suddenly they're getting pinched? And actually one thing that a Democratic pollster commented to me is that, for years and years, Democrats have been saying that Republicans want to, or these people want to end a woman's right to choose, and that a lot of voters thought that that was an exaggeration or mischaracterization. But what if, through the Supreme Court, that is in effect what happens? Does that change things? So lots and lots, but the thing is, though, the default position is that it's a referendum on an incumbent, and it's about how the economy is doing overall, and it only gets pulled off of that by who Republicans nominate, or if something just changes the chemistry that's there. Now, does President Biden run for another term or not? I don't think he'll decide till after the midterm election. I mean, that's traditionally what happens. I'd be kind of surprised to see him do that. But then, would Vice President Harris get the Democratic nomination? Well, we know that the last 4 sitting vice presidents who have sought their party's nomination, all 4 of them got it. But at the same time, she's, there's a lot of concern within the party about whether it should be strong or not. There's some talk about Pete Buttigieg getting in and running, but then there's questions about whether, he could do it. Who else jumps in? We just have no earthly idea. And on the other hand, I don't think former President Trump will decide till after after next November's midterm elections. But, I had been kind of skeptical that he'd run again, but I'll be darned if I could point to a single thing he said or done that would lead me to think he won't. And I don't know that he can walk off the stage. I don't know that he's capable personally of walking off the stage unless his health forced it. So, and if I'm a Democrat, the question is, would I rather have former President Trump, or would I rather have a Trump-like figure without maybe some of the personality attributes that President Trump has? And would they be better off against a DeSantis? I don't know that, or not. I mean, I don't know. What I do know is that nobody, if President Trump seeks the Republican nomination, I don't think anybody is going to beat him. I really, really don't. And 2, I don't think anyone from the non-Trump wing of the party can possibly win the nomination next year. And, at some point you will see things, you may see a exodus of suburban or college-educated voters that had been Republicans that moved over into the Democratic column. At some point they may move back and they may reconstitute the Republican Party, and you may have the more centrist wing of the party come back up. But until that happens, the makeup of the Republican Party changes, the Trump wing is going to be dominant. And it's probably the most fascinating, and people look at you like you're crazy, but perhaps the weirdest thing I'm hearing is we've seen some news reports, but I've actually had some Republican members mention that what if Republicans win a majority in the House, and what if Trump decided he wanted to be Speaker instead? Because you don't have to be a member of the House to be elected Speaker of the House. And when you consider the members that voted for impeachment, when you think about the members that voted to certify, when you think about the members that, a lot of those people those Republicans aren't going to be back. And you look at the ranks of the others and you say, how many of them are going to take a position against Donald Trump and think they could win a primary? So that if he decided that he'd rather be Speaker, rather not take a risk of losing a general election again, or the first time, if you're think things along, could that happen? Wow. And I know that's really weird and people have a hard time getting their arms around it, but and the thing is, he could actually do that for a year or so and still run for president. How about that? So if you think things have been weird so far, rest assured it could get weirder. So anyway, Joseph, you want to come up, and I think it looks like you've already grabbed some questions. So anyway, come on up, Joseph, and let's.
Going to give a tiny break for our interpreters and CART folks, and also thank them for all they do to make all of our events accessible and inclusive. What you noticed, as Charlie told you, we're both from Louisiana, both from the same town, actually. You saw a little bit of two Southern caricatures. I'm a mumbler, and Charlie's a fast talker, and both have
long-winded,
and both have created a little bit of a disturbance for our ASL and our CART folks. So, thank you, Carla, for keeping up with Charlie.
My apologies.
But yeah, we have a lot of great questions that have jumped in. So I'm going to just go for it and start. And folks have asked some really great things here. So I'm just going to read them verbatim because they're so great. Is a coup already underway for 2024 with gerrymandering enabling state legislatures to throw out election results, restrictions on voting, etc.?
I told some folks earlier this evening that my wife calls me a pathological optimist. And this is the kind of thing that up until the last year I would have scoffed at, but with things that we've seen happen in the last year and back in January and are seen in various legislatures, I don't think it can be scoffed at anymore. And I think one thing that happens is for Republican legislators, and again, just as in the U.S. House, in a lot of the state legislatures, most of them are in very Republican districts, have to run in Republican primaries, and if they don't, even if they didn't think that this was a real problem, expecting them to vote against more restrictive procedures, it's a tough ask because it might be tantamount to saying I don't want to ever win a Republican primary again. And this is tough stuff. But the last edition of Profiles in Courage has already gone to the printer, and it's even if you believe in your heart that most of the time you do the right thing, you're not going to be around to do the right thing even some of the time if you do something that's going to result in you losing a primary for sure. And so I don't know what I could say credibly that would say that this is not something that we should all really worry about.
Sure.
And you think about the difference between a Western democracy and a third, a 10-horn dictatorship. It's what? Respecting elections, rule of law, and peaceful transfer of power. And I think in our nation's history, those things have never been, I think, credibly in question. Right. But we kind of had that now. And I don't know how to answer this if this were a room full of college students, because I would probably not be quite as candid. But I do worry about where we're going, and I'm an optimist.
Is there any hope that the country will go more toward the middle on both sides? And if so, how do we get there? If not, can we maintain a democracy?
We've talked about this in previous years where I think we have effectively codified a two-party system, between the Electoral College and the requirement to have, if nobody has a majority in the Electoral College, to win a majority in the House of Representatives with each state getting one vote, and there are no independents in the House. Effectively, we have a parliamentary system in a country with only two real parties, and which, I don't know, may be the worst of all worlds. But the thing is, it means that we could elect independents to the House of Representatives, we could elect independents to the Senate, and frankly, I think there's nothing wrong with the Senate that 3 or 4 or 5 legitimately independents wouldn't help, or a dozen or two in the House. But in terms of the presidency, that's not going to happen, and it basically requires one party going way too far one way, and then a backlash, and it goes the other. But a third party, I don't think that's going to happen. And I kind of think that anything that and that, just to get a little bit more depressed, I had thought that our problem of extreme partisanship and tribalization, you would have thought that a national crisis along the lines of 9/11 would have fixed it, right? And it did for a few months until the fight over Iraq. And you'd think, well, maybe a public health crisis, maybe that would do it. I mean, how do you politicize a public health crisis? Except we did. And, and some of it, I think, is obviously when you have a sitting president who is openly skeptical and about the severity of a problem and starts to politicize it. But it's not all Trump, though. I mean, some of it, it's Google. I mean, we have someone that comes in once a week and helps clean our house. And my wife was asking her if she had been vaccinated yet. And she said, no, I'm still doing my research. And when Lucy told me about that, I'm thinking, wait a minute, I don't think I'm qualified to judge the research. I know she's not. But, anybody with Google and 5 minutes on their hands thinks they're an expert at something. And then think about just the respect for institutions and expertise and leaders. And that the attack, that people don't trust anything big anymore, or any influential people anymore. And so this, if you were going to write a novel to scare the hell out of people, one that in the past people would have shut and said, that's ridiculous. It could describe sort of where we've been. So, if the Almighty did not smile upon the United States of America, we'd have been gone a long time ago. But I wish he'd smile soon, quickly, he or she. I wish they'd do it, but I don't know. So I don't know what changes things, Joseph.
And I think you're right. There's definitely a death of expertise, or the respective expertise. You got a few questions that are but they are state specific. So I'm going to go through a series of those to get your thoughts. Will the suburban women who voted for Youngkin in Virginia after having voted for Biden flip back and vote Democratic if Roe is overturned?
Interesting. Well, a couple things about Virginia, where Glenn Youngkin, I remember meeting him several years ago, when he was at the Carlyle Group private equity firm. And as I remember, he's kind of a boring guy, but not anything flashy, and had nothing that would look or behave like Donald Trump, okay? And so attaching him to Donald Trump, they just sort of didn't really ring true. But but the thing is, and I've heard people criticize Terry McAuliffe, and McAuliffe had been, I've known Terry since 1982. I didn't think he'd win the governorship. He did. I wondered whether he'd be a good governor. He was a terrific governor. Virginia did really, really well. And you would have thought, against running again with the state doing well and the state having trended more Democrat in recent years, that he would be in a pretty good shape. And I've heard some people criticize, his campaign, but I frankly thought his campaign was pretty good. But they say, all he wanted to do was tie Youngkin to Trump. Well, the thing about it is, what was McAuliffe supposed to talk about? How about that Afghanistan? How about, hey, we're doing great against the coronavirus? Hey, the economy, what was he supposed to talk about? And so I don't think it was a bad campaign. I mean, he made one mistake in a debate, but the thing is, that race had been in private polling. I had some Democratic strategists tell me that it was almost even at Labor Day, way back before any of the public polling was showing that. So, but Youngkin may have been a unicorn in the sense that he didn't have to get through a primary. First of all, a guy like Glenn Youngkin probably couldn't have won a Republican primary in Virginia, number one. So he couldn't have gotten past it, or if he did, he would have to pull off and go way out in right field, which would have hurt him in a general election. So he didn't have to do that. And that he walked that thin line between embracing former President Trump or repudiating him. He walked it very, very skillfully, and frankly, I think more skillfully than a lot of Republican candidates will likely be able to do. So I don't know that it could be replicated that easily, but it is something that, it's something that Democrats need to really worry about, and they need to know that just yelling Trump, Trump, Trump isn't always going to work in competitive states, even a state that has been trending Democratic.
So a little bit further south from there in Georgia, will the governor race with the incumbent being primaried and Abrams being a strong candidate get Warnock reelected?
Yeah, the thing is, I think it'd be easy for a Democrat to lose heart looking at 2022. But the saving grace, is how does a party win that's getting split in half? With your former senator running against a current governor, both of the same party, with your Republican presidential nominee for the last two times attacking a governor that heretofore had been a really conservative guy. I mean, so that if you're, to the extent that we're seeing that happening place in place, there is hope for Democrats where there might not naturally be hope. But at the same time, think about this as a little thought experiment. What if then President Trump had reacted like an adult after the November election? And what if he had forget not giving an Al Gore speech like 2000, that's a little bit too much to ask, but just taking it remotely diplomatically. I think given how close the Democratic wins in both those Georgias, to be honest, I think in retrospect, Republicans would have held on to both those seats so that President Biden would be dealing with 48 Democrats and 52 Republicans. And I have to assume that the incremental, kind of boring, incremental center-left Joe Biden that most of us expected, that's actually what would have happened had President Trump not behaved the way he did, and that's changed a lot of things, and that it's weird how these things work. But I think effectively the morning after Georgia, it's like the president's like a quarterback, and he called an audible at the line of scrimmage. I think he just changed the play. And they went from a draw play, a handoff, a quarterback to throwing the long bomb. And whether that was the right decision or the wrong decision, I'm a small c conservative. I would have gone the more incremental way, acknowledging how much good will come because of the infrastructure, and I think a somewhat scaled down. I think the BBB is going to get through. I think it's going to be slimmed down some, but I think it's going to happen and will benefit a lot of people, but will it benefit enough people before the 2022 midterm election? I don't know. It took the Affordable Care Act a little while. It was unpopular for a long time before it was popular.
So what about here in Iowa? We have a Senate race next year. And This questioner says Iowans say they want new and younger lawmakers, but still seem to support having Senator Grassley in the Senate. Do you think there's a scenario in which our Senate race is a competitive race next year?
Well, I'm really tempted to weasel out of that by saying what was that phrase? Any chance? I mean, there's a chance for everything. But just looking through, well, the Des Moines Register poll, Ann Selzer's a very good pollster. I've combed through her last two surveys, and I'd be hard-pressed to point to anything that I think shows that Senator Grassley is vulnerable. I mean, I can't. I mean, things happen, but maybe they're looking at some data, private data that is not obvious in the public, but I don't see that. And you know what has become one of the best predictors of elections now? Population density. The less dense the state is, the more it's trending Republican. And this is a state that not long ago was pretty purple, and now sort of not so much. By the way, just a point, one of is it the 2nd district that was settled by 6 votes? We had a Democratic primary for the U.S. House, a special election a month ago, settled by 5 votes. So, when people say, well, my vote doesn't matter, well, look at Iowa too, look at Florida, I think it's 20. It's like, wow, these things can matter.
This one's from a Drake journalism student. What advice do you have for students pursuing careers in political journalism, and should political journalists stop trying to predict elections?
Well, the question is, am I a journalist or not? I don't know. Was that an online question?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to tell a story on myself. Our youngest, Jeffrey, was in college. He was in his freshman year, and he was talking about majoring in political science, and I talked him out of it. So he majored in mass communications instead. Now, I'm on the board of visitors for a journalism school, but I wanted to blow my brains out. But he got internships, which is going to be the key phrase coming up in a minute, 2 summers at ABC News in their Washington bureau, and within 72 hours of graduating, they called him with an offer. Wow. And he was a year before his boss knew that he was related to me. So, but he's been there 6 years, but the key, it's internships. Whether you in government, whether in journalism, the key is internships. And I just can't stress that more. And if you get in and just work your rear end off, you can break through. And it doesn't have to be starting off with a network, and it could be starting off anywhere, but internships, I think that's just everything.
I agree with you. And
he's been at ABC for 6 years now. So
that's why we support internships at the Harkin Institute. Do you believe the Electoral College is still serving its intended purpose?
Well, I don't think the Electoral College is going anywhere. I mean, the small states are just not, this was part of a compromise you all wrote from the founders, and it's just not going to go away. Now, I think a middle ground position, I wish every state would switch to the way Nebraska and Maine, where whoever wins a congressional district gets that one electoral vote, and whoever wins the state wins the other 2. And I think, because the thing is, if you just got rid of it, went to straight popular vote, let's face it, presidential candidates would between 7 or 8 major metropolitan areas, and the rest of the country would not see any of them. And people that lived in major metropolitan areas would be very well represented, and people that lived in smaller rural states, not at all, or very little. So I don't think, A, it's going to happen. B, I'm not sure straight popular is the answer. I don't like the idea of someone winning fewer votes being president of the United States, but if you did the district by district, it would incentivize presidential candidates to move around the country and to go to, you look at Nebraska, where the 2nd District of Nebraska, Omaha, they got a lot of attention. Now, the rest of the state didn't get the time of day, but at least one did. And Maine's 2nd Congressional District, which is a swing district, it got a lot of attention. So I think, to me, that is, rather than waste a lot of breath trying to get rid of the Electoral College, which isn't going to happen, I would try to do something that is more manageable and I think would address a lot of the shortcomings in the current system. So I would do that. Okay. Of course, I also think ranked choice voting is something worth looking at too. I'll confess, about 25 years ago, this guy comes into me in my office to meet with me and to try to pitch me on, y'all know what ranked choice voting is, and I all but threw him out of my office because to me it was a solution in search of a problem. The system was working fine, and over time it's like, gosh, this isn't working very well, is it? And I'm starting to feel guilty, and it's being used, and it's not a silver bullet. I don't think it's going to solve all of our political problems, but I think it's definitely something that shows some promise in trying to keep some of the more exotic people from getting elected in certain kinds of districts and both sides. Mm-hmm. And I think you would have a smaller wacko factor in Congress if you had ranked choice voting. So I have some guilt about how my first reaction to that. I should actually, I know who he is, I should apologize to him. Actually, it's probably a good column for me to write is,
That's
sorry.
A sign of maturity that you've learned and grown, right?
Well, I had to get pretty damn obvious before I was willing to admit it. But.
Well, if we look at some other legacy systems, if you will, do you believe the Senate will ever eliminate the filibuster?
I wish Tom Harkin were here. Back in the old days, the filibuster was used for some evil purposes occasionally, sometimes. But when you look at the numbers, it was very rare that the filibuster was actually utilized. And either outright filibusters or the threat of filibusters. I mean, the thing is, in the old days, if somebody wanted to filibuster, basically they would be told, okay, go ahead. Let's see how big your bladder is. Start now. Go ahead. And where you and however many are helping, and make them talk. And they all end. Sooner or later they end. And when the Senate changed its rules to allow double tracking, so in other words, okay, this bill, so-and-so is going to filibuster this, so we will just freeze it in place and let other legislation go by. And what that did was it relieved the pressure on the member or members who are filibustering. It takes them off the hook. There's not a pressure on them to give in. So I would go back to the old rules where if you want to filibuster, knock yourself out. But don't count on leaving the floor. And you remember, as a presidential candidate, Bill Clinton's line on abortion would be they should be legal, safe
rare.
And rare, legal, safe. I mean, it was, to me, you make filibusters rare. You don't get, but you try to create where it is not done except under extraordinary circumstances. And I think in the days of C-SPAN and things, I don't know that you could have the days when an anti-lynching bill would be filibustered,
Let's hope.
Or civil. I mean, so I would try doing that, but I don't think, the thing is, every time the rules are changed, or in recent years, when Democrats have pushed for reforms, it's come around to bite them on the rear end. And I'm afraid, and that's where some of the efforts against some of the really kind of far out there Republicans in the House, I would be very concerned about what might happen if Democrats are in the minority and any Democratic House member says something that a majority of Republicans didn't like, whether they get stripped of their committee chairmanships or stuff like that. I mean, the thing is, I think these people marginalize themselves a fair amount, but I would just be worried about applying rules that I wouldn't want to be either applied or misapplied towards me. And some of the stuff is playing with fire. I mean, I think Marjorie Taylor Greene, I think she does more for the Democratic Party than most of the Democrats in Congress. I mean, yeah. Seriously, I mean, anyway.
Well, we only have time for one more question, and this person would like to know if you have considered or if you think open primaries might be helpful in eliminating some of the more colorful, exotic candidates, if you will.
Yeah, again, I don't think there's one silver bullet, but for states that do have party registration, if nothing else, if you just allowed independents to vote, to show up on election day and decide whether they want a Democratic ballot or a Republican ballot, I think that would be helpful. To be honest, the old thing about, well, you'd have people in one party voting for the weakest candidate in the other party, I've actually never seen that happen. But I understand that partisans like to have their clubhouse and they don't want any outsiders in their clubhouse. So I understand why they don't want people in the opposite party able to vote in their primaries, even though I would. But for independents in states with party registration, I think that'd be helpful. But I think things have gotten. I think it may take multiple solutions, and that might be one. And whether you do open in that sense, or whether you go to a California, or Louisiana, top two, or I mean, there are all kinds of different ways that might pull the system back towards the middle, but I wouldn't have unrealistic expectations that any one of them would solve the problems, because I don't think any one thing got us into this ditch. I mean, we're in a deep ditch, and I think it was multiple factors that got us into it, and it may take multiple events and things to get us out.
Well, I think that's right. I would like to ask your permission to ask one more, because this one came in really early, and they wanted to know whether or not there are ways that the will of the people can be exercised in lieu of legislative bodies taking action. So in particular, can any sort of citizen-initiated ballot measures be used to address some of the issues that we're seeing national and state levels?
Well, this is such a politically wired audience that if I say something, somebody probably could contradict me, but can't remember I've ever, but let's just say rarely do legislators voluntarily give up any power. And so when it does happen, it's usually done over their dead bodies with binding initiatives, binding referenda. But even then, where we've had some of these independent commissions created, they're being circumvented. I mean, I don't know that has been a problem here, but in a bunch of these states with new commissions, they're getting ignored or contaminated so that it's not creating the kind of districts that God would draw if she were drawing maps. And so to the extent that ballot initiatives, and again, they scare me because we've all seen voters manipulated by ads that may or may not be completely accurate or fair, completely misleading. But legislature, I mean, I don't know how you do it unless you had ballot initiatives that were very, very carefully drafted with little or no room for partisan legislators of either side to knock it off track. But we're seeing, Republicans are in charge in a lot more states than Democrats are. But you look at Maryland or Illinois, for example; those are Democratic gerrymanders, and there are a lot fewer states than there are Republican. But and that Republicans have actually not gone completely to the wall in quite as many states as some people feared. But some of these maps are that both sides are doing are pretty outrageous. It's just that Republicans are in a position to do it far more places than Democrats are. But and part of it is the expectation that the other party is going to do us in, so we got to do unto them before they do it to us. And you can justify anything that way. Okay, there will be antidepressants being handed out at the doors on the way out. This is not what I wanted to do. But anyway, thank you all very much for coming out. Thanks for supporting the Harkin Institute. The great scholars and people working at the Institute are doing great, remarkable things. And the Institute stays way away from politics, so I'm really the only real contamination that happens in terms of partisan politics with the Institute. It's stayed very, very pure. But thank you all for coming out. Thanks for what you do, and thanks for having me back out.
Thank you. And I'd like to just thank Charlie again for being here in person, and thank all of you for returning to Sheslow Auditorium to be with us in person for this event. And thank everyone for joining us online. Have a great rest of your 2021, and we'll see you in 2022. Good night.
I must have lost my good ones.